decades, or again, loosely over the next half century or so. I think, as I suggested earlier, that we tend to dwell too much on this notion that public opinion is what drives policy. I think a lot of the causality works in exactly the opposite direction. And essentially, here's what happens, and I think you can tell a story that works very well with the data for many other rich countries as well. What happens is that at particular moments in time, governments put in place new policies because they think that they'll solve a pressing social problem. Sometimes it's because there's a big demand for it, but in many cases there's not. Think of Medicare, for example. Medicare and Medicaid put in place in the mid-1960s. People were not on the streets across America demanding Medicare or a new government health insurance program for the elderly and for the poor. But it happened. They were on the streets at the time demanding civil rights, for example, and they had been for over a decade. And that eventually got passed. But for Medicare, not so much. Same is true in the 1930s. We often have this sort of vague notion that during the Great Depression, lots of Americans were suffering economically. There were massive demonstrations and an outpouring of letters to Congress and strikes in factories demanding the specific programs that got put in place. But in fact, there was only, at least as best we can tell, limited indication that Americans knew what they wanted from government at that point in time. Basically, people just wanted government to do something. And the specific policies that were put in place were the ones that policymakers, with some advice from unions and policy advocates and other people, ended up putting in place. The programs then worked, and people come to like them. Not all of them work, of course, but the ones that do work, people get attached to. And that's why you, at a later point in time, get, well, just flicking back here to this chart, you get strong associations like this. This is not so much because Danes over here, for example, for the whole of the past century have been demanding big government policies, and the government then responded. Instead, it's because at particular points in time, government put in place policies that Danes then came to like. And so new generations are born, and they come into a society where these policies exist. They get used to them, they see that they work, that the society functions just fine, in the same way that Americans now take Medicare for granted. It's not that for the whole of the past century, Americans were demanding a large government program providing health care for the elderly, and finally the government put it in place. Instead, government put it in place, and now we're completely used to it, and very few of us would want to do away with it. Okay, so let me come back to... yeah, so what does this imply for the future? Well, just a couple of illustrated points. So, Americans, I think, want financial security and economic opportunity. As I just suggested, at various points in our history, we've had certain types of needs that have been filled partially or extensively by various types of government programs. Back in the 1800s, public schools; in the 1930s, unemployment insurance, retirement security, and actually a whole slew of other things. In the 1950s and 60s, we tried to do away with the racial and gender discrimination with the Civil Rights Act in 1964. In the 60s, there's a huge expansion of college education. From the 1960s through 2010, finally, and hopefully going beyond, trying to deal with health care. These are just a few of the examples of policies that have been put in place, partially in response to popular demand, but largely in response to perceived need. So government programs are put in place to help, and if they work well, Americans come to like them. And here, interestingly, this is a reason why I think, in some respects, although the kind of conventional wisdom is that public opinion is a huge obstacle to expanded government in the United States, in some ways it's actually an asset. When government programs are put in place that work, people do come to like them, and then it's hard to take them away. We see this most visibly now with Medicare. I don't think it's 100% guaranteed that Medicare is going to survive in its existing form over the next decade. There are some very prominent policymakers who would like to replace it or do away with it entirely. But I think that's pretty unlikely that they'll succeed. There's a nice book by political scientist Paul Pearson that tells the story of the...
Before you get into that, could I just ask a question?
Yeah.
With respect to the dichotomy that you've just discussed, would you say that the idea that people want want the policies, or at least once the policies are in place, the reason the policies are in place was that support the idea that humans are basically altruistic and want to help each other, as opposed to the opposite of that.
I think it's consistent with that notion, certainly. I think it's unlikely that we, and when I say we, I mean here in the United States and most other rich countries, and as I think we'll almost certainly see over time, as poorer countries develop economically, as they get richer, they'll put some of these types of policies in place. I think it would be much less likely for that to happen if humans weren't altruistic. But that's not necessarily the driving force. It also comes down in part to creative problem solving. So figuring out that private markets aren't fully doing the job in the way that we like. So it's partly altruism. There's also some self-interest involved. But it's also creative problem solving. So as I was saying, although I don't think public opinion tends to be the main driver of creation of government programs, and therefore the fact that Americans at an abstract level don't really like big government isn't a huge obstacle. I do think public opinion tends to help when it comes to safeguarding these programs once they exist. If they work, they get popular, it doesn't entirely remove the possibility that they can be taken away or retrenched or cut back and so on. We've seen that happen with some programs over time, but it makes it less likely. So there's an area where public opinion does help, does matter. Okay, let me turn to the second of these. The left is losing its electoral base and therefore may not be in a position, and it's of course the left that's most likely to drive the creation or expansion of these types of programs that fill in holes in our springboard or our safety net. Okay. Since the 1930s, the main base of the Democratic Party has been the working class and the poor in the United States. It's not the only group of people that like the Democrats or vote for the Democrats, but this certainly has been the heart of the Democratic Party. According to a now very common view, not just here in the U.S., this is true in many other countries as well, but this is eroding. A lot of it has to do with shifts in concerns about what's important to people. So the idea, or at least this is how the argument goes, the idea that people vote less based on their economic self-interest, perceived economic self-interest, and so on. But there are a variety of arguments as to exactly why this is. Some of you probably know this book by Thomas Frank, What's the Matter with Kansas? It's sort of the most prominent expression of this view, I think, in the last decade or so, especially as it applies to American politics. This group in our society, which has historically been the base of the Democratic Party, is increasingly less likely to vote for Democrats, according to this argument. I think, it's not that this is entirely wrong, but I think it's largely wrong on two counts, or at least the worry is overstated on two important counts. So the first is that there's an alternative electoral base, which already has become important for Democrats, at least in national elections. This varies a lot depending on what state or locality you're talking about. But there's an alternative electoral base. And then secondly, I think the importance of the economy, of economic performance, and specifically income growth, remains. It hasn't dissipated much, if at all, in the last generation, even though the kind of story that people like Thomas Frank and others tell is plausible. It seems to make sense. But if you look at the data, excuse me, there's a very strong case to be made that it's still the economy that's the fundamental, paramount determinant of how people vote and who wins elections, and what types of, which of the two political parties Americans tend to prefer. Okay, so let me elaborate a little bit. Let me start with the first. So even if Democrats don't win big among the, and I put in parentheses here, white working class, because that's where the argument lies. Very few people disagree about the fact that African American and Latino working class and poor are still very, very likely to vote Democratic. This is mainly a story about working class whites, and to some degree poor whites. So the counter argument here was laid out about a decade ago in a book by John Judas and Rui Teixeira. Teixeira is a student of public opinion who works currently at the Center for American Progress. They wrote this nice book, I think, laying out the case both demographically and geographically for why the Democrats still have a fighting chance, even if they don't continue to win big among working class whites. The argument about other groups that can at least give Democrats a good chance of winning, doesn't guarantee electoral victory, focuses on three specific pieces of America. So one is urban professionals, a second is women, and the third is racial ethnic minorities, especially African Americans and Hispanics. And here's some data. I don't know if those of you in the back are going to be able to see this, but I'll just sort of summarize it. These are data from exit polls from the 2008 presidential election, which is a little bit strange. I mean, it was a very strongly Democratic election. But the point is just to give you a sense of how large these groups are as a share of the voting population, and then how strongly Democratic they are. So I'm just going to point out a couple of things by way of suggesting some support for this notion that these other groups can help. They're not the full solution, but that they can help. So on the horizontal axis here is the group's share of all voters, not of all eligible voters. That's useful to know, but of course what really matters is people who show up at the polls, who actually vote. So here's women. They're about 50% of all voters. And on the vertical axis is the share who voted for the Democratic candidate, Obama, against John McCain. The dotted line here shows the 50% cutoff, and you can see that women are well above the 50% line. So they're a big chunk of the population. They voted strongly Democratic. That's been fairly consistent with elections over the last 20 or 30 years, although of course it varies. There's not data here that isolates urban professionals, but you can see that this group of with high education, so 16 plus years, so that's a 4-year college degree or more, were a fairly large share of the electorate, about 40%. They're smaller in the overall population, but among the voting population, they're a pretty big chunk, and they were strongly Democratic, or strongly enough Democratic to help Obama. And people who live in cities, as opposed to suburbs, and where's rural area, rural down here, also strongly Democratic, although city per se is a much smaller share of the electorate. And then lastly, African Americans and Hispanics, both are much smaller as a share of the population. They're each about 12–13% or so. As a share of the electorate, even smaller because they tend not to vote as much as white Americans. So they're over here, further to the left on the horizontal axis, blacks and Hispanics, but very strongly Democratic voting. So again, none of this is to say that this guarantees Democrats electoral success. It's just to say that it gives them a fighting chance, at least for the foreseeable future, even if among their traditional electoral base, they don't do so well. They don't dominate in the way that they did back in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and even through the 1970s. There's a geographical component of the argument too, which has to do with presidential elections, and I spent a long time on this, but I just want to give you a hint. Most of you are familiar with this because you no doubt watch the TV carefully on election night, and you've seen the maps that show which sections of the countries are now solidly blue and solidly red, but it's worth just looking at the math kind of quickly. Democrats in the last since 2000, you can stretch it even a little further back, have done quite well in the Northeast, along the West Coast, in Illinois, because Chicago is so important, it's a big urban center and strongly Democratic, and in the state of Hawaii. Oh, and also Washington, D.C., which matters for electoral votes. It's not that these are guaranteed. You know, one of those northeastern states is Pennsylvania, and although Democrats have won Pennsylvania the last several times, they could lose it. They could even lose a few of the seemingly guaranteed blue states. But this gives them 215 electoral votes if these states continue to go, which means that they need 55 more, which you can get through some interesting combination of this group of Midwestern states. Democrats have won Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota each of the last three or four times. Ohio occasionally, Iowa fairly consistently. These are increasingly in play, as you know, especially New Mexico, of course, but increasingly these. And then Florida and Virginia are kind of flipping. Virginia is really split, as is Florida. But all Democrats need is 55 more. None of this is a guarantee. It just establishes the plausibility of a fighting chance for Democrats. In this case, in presidential elections, even if their support has diminished and maybe continues to do so among that traditional electoral base. Now, I'm going to say in a second that I think there's reason to think it won't continue to diminish. So let me get to that. A second piece, well, actually I'll come specifically to that in just a moment. A second piece of this looks at the way that party preference and voting are still very, very importantly influenced by the state of the economy, and especially by income growth. And I'm going to show you three pieces of evidence in this respect. So one is a story that gets right at the center piece of this thesis that support among working class whites has left the Democrats and is unlikely to come back. The Thomas Frank story says this is all about abortion and school prayer and other social and cultural issues rather than about economic issues. I think that's probably wrong. It's not that there's no truth to it, I just think it's fundamentally wrong. And I'll tell you why. And secondly, I'm going to show you a little data on how income growth is a very good predictor of changes in party preference among low-income whites over time and an important regional difference. And then thirdly, I'll say something about how income growth or the performance of the economy is still a very good predictor of presidential election outcomes. Let me start though with the notion that working class whites left the Democratic Party because of social and cultural issues, becoming more important to them than economic self-interest, if you will. This shows data from a survey called the General Social Survey, which unfortunately begins only in the early 1970s, so we don't have data going back any further over time. But what I'm showing you here is among people who self-identify as working class, so they're asked a question, what class position would you put yourself in? They're actually given four choices, it's not an open-ended question. You could say lower, working, middle, or upper. And in all of these years, interestingly, you might be surprised to know this, about 45% of Americans say working class. If you ask an open-ended question, almost every American will say middle class. Almost nobody says rich or poor. Some do, but not very many. But in this specific question where you're given four choices, roughly as many people say working class, even today, as say middle class. Again, very few people say poor or lower class or upper class. So this is roughly 45%, and this is whites only, so I'm leaving out racial ethnic minorities. And this is the share who say that, they're asked another question that says, what's your party preference, or which party do you identify with, Democrat or Republican, or are you independent? And there's also some nuance, you could say strong or sort of slight Democrat, strong or slight Republican. I've grouped those together. The blue line, of course, is the share saying Democratic. The red line is the share saying Republican among working class whites in this survey. And you can see that back in the early to mid-1970s, there was a huge gap. This had almost certainly existed since the 1930s, or roughly after the 1930s, although we don't have really good data to go back that far. About 60% of this group identifying with the Democrats, around 30 or so with the Republicans. In the late 1970s, specifically around the year 1978, although I don't want to try to be too precise about this, but in the late 1970s, this begins to change. And you see a gradual convergence. So fewer and fewer people over time among this group identifying Democratic and more identifying Republican, until by the early 1990s, it's essentially evenly split. About 40% each saying, and then there's another 20% or so who say they're independent. And things really haven't changed much since then. In 2008, you can see this big, but that's not surprising. It is that the economy fell apart. There's a lot of enthusiasm for Obama. I haven't checked this for 2010 yet, the most recent year the survey was done. Well, was this because, so this chart, I don't want to belabor this. This just shows that it wasn't in the South only. It actually happened in every region of the country, the South, the Midwest, Northeast, West Coast. The conventional hypotheses here, and there are lots and lots of books and articles and so on that tell this story. So some talk about how the working class has become much more conservative, began to in the 1970s. Others talk about how the Democratic Party lurched to the left on a lot of issues, and usually George McGovern is kind of at the centerpiece of this particular story. And then the Thomas Frank type story is that social and cultural issues came to the fore. This group of people started to think, this is what's really important to me, not the economy. I think a much better explanation focuses on what we might call the 1973 to 83 economic crisis. where although there wasn't a Great Depression-like sustained downturn in the GDP and sustained really high unemployment rate, there were two very deep recessions, one beginning in 1973, the other beginning in 1980, that sort of bookended this period. And then the late 1990s, where there actually was economic growth, was in many respects a terrible period economically. You had, for the first time ever in American history, very high inflation coupled with high unemployment, very high interest rates, and the beginning of the period of stagnation in income growth. Republicans were able, in the late 1970s, to tell what seemed to be a very plausible and simple story about why this had happened. Democrats overreached and went too far with the New Deal types of policies. Democrats, remember, were in charge. They had big majorities in both the House and the Senate, partly a result of Watergate, during the period when Jimmy Carter was president. So you have a Democratic president, very strong majorities in both houses of Congress, so they seemed to preside over this collapse in the American economy, which stretched over roughly a decade. Now, the Republicans were in charge, and Reagan was president, and the Republicans held the Senate in the early 1980s during the recession, but it was very easy for them, and seemingly a fair number of people believed it, to say, well, this is just a legacy of when the Democrats were in charge. So I'll show you just a little bit of data on this. This is income growth from the middle on down in the income distribution. This is for families, adjusted for inflation. And in the late 1940s, we have good data on this beginning right after World War II. In the 50s and 60s, it's going up at a pretty healthy clip. Basically, incomes double for almost everyone in the American population between World War II and the early to mid 1970s. But then they begin to, these lines show 1973 to 83, then it begins to flatten out in roughly 1973. Maybe some people didn't really notice this, but the recession in 73 to 75 was really deep and much longer than recessions in the 50s and 60s had been. So it's pretty clear that people began to get frustrated. These are data for inflation and unemployment. I probably don't need to show you these because many of you are kind of familiar with the story. But you can see that both of them jump up to much higher levels, especially inflation, in this period from 1973 to the early 1980s. And then this is interest rates on a 30-year fixed mortgage loan. Of course, buying a house has always been really critical to the American dream. And in the late 70s, early 80s, the interest rate gets up near 20%, which to many Americans was just unfathomable. It seemed to put this key element of the American dream out of reach for a whole generation. Now, all of these are just kind of snippets that tell the story of a really bad economic period. And again, the key point here is that Republicans, especially Ronald Reagan, but not only Reagan, were able to blame Democrats for this. I think this is a much more useful explanation for this pattern that we see here than any of the other stories that are commonly told, especially or including the kind of Thomas Frank story about abortion and school prayer and other social and cultural issues becoming much more important. Okay. I'm going to skip over the second part for lack of time and just go straight to this. Yes?
Isn't that despite the fact that every recession has been under a Republican president since World War II?
Well, there were a couple in the 50s, well, I guess, let's see, not in the 50s. I think there was one in the 1960s that was under a Democratic president. And actually, the 80 recession begins. Of course, Jimmy Carter's still in office until January of 81, so technically it begins. But yeah, it is true that most recessions have occurred under Republican presidents. But again, the key point here is that Republicans, especially Reagan, in the run-up to the election, were able to fashion an argument that people believed that said, look, this is the Democrats' fault. And part of the reason for the length and depth of the recession in the early 1980s was that the Federal Reserve decided to jack interest rates way up in order to deal with inflation. And they could say, look, we're forced to do this. It's the only way to get out of the high inflation episode. We're forced to do this because the Democrats mucked everything up. So we have to have this really deep recession to clean up the economy. And people believed it. And of course, there was a lot of luck involved too. The economy turned around in 1984, just in time for Reagan's re-election. Had it not, he might have been a one-term president. We're actually going through an interesting parallel right now, of course. If the economy turns up in the next year, I think Barack Obama has a pretty good chance of getting re-elected. If it doesn't, I think there's a really, really strong likelihood he won't, regardless of how the campaign goes. I think not necessarily regardless of who the Republicans nominate, but if in fact, Mitt Romney, who will be able to portray himself as a fairly sensible, moderate potential president, if the economy doesn't turn up, Obama is probably in trouble. And that gets me to this chart, which is from a political scientist, Douglas Hibbs, that looks at, this is the vote share for the presidential candidate of the party that currently holds the office. And this is an average of income growth in the 4 years leading up to the election, but weighted more, so this is a kind of a complicated statistical measure, it's weighted much more heavily the closer you get to the election. So income growth, this is just average income growth for the whole population. Income growth in the year of the election counts a lot more in this statistical measure than it does in the first year of a president's term. But it's essentially a kind of complicated, but really not that complicated measure of how well the economy is doing. It's not the same thing as GDP growth, but it's not too far away from that. It's a very good predictor of presidential election outcomes for almost the whole of the post-World War II period, so going all the way back to 1952. You have two noticeable exceptions. This is 1952 and 1968, where the actual vote for the candidate of the incumbent party was a lot lower than the economy would have predicted. You can see that the vote on the vertical axis is way below what the prediction line suggests. In both cases, that's pretty easily explicable due to deaths in a foreign war. So the Democrats were presiding over the Korean War, a lot of people had been killed, a lot of Americans were fed up with this in 1952, and you get a Republican elected, even though the economy was doing pretty well. And you all know the story of Vietnam in 1968, when Johnson has to bow out, feels he has to bow out, because Vietnam had become fairly unpopular. Apart from that, it's not perfect, it's not a perfect predictor, but it's really stunning in some ways that this one single measure is such a good predictor of the outcome of presidential elections. Here is 2008, just in case you're curious. It predicts pretty low vote share for the incumbent party, which was the Republicans, of course. John McCain is a new candidate, but the Republicans were the incumbent party. And in fact, their vote share was almost exactly as predicted, only slightly lower. Okay, so the key point here is simply that the economy, especially income growth, the economy more broadly, I think arguably, according to a lot of evidence, remains very, very, very important. If it's the case that Democrats can manage the economy fairly well, or Republicans muck it up, as they seem to have done in the lead up to the 2008 election, then I think Democrats will continue, almost regardless, not literally regardless, but almost regardless of how well they do among working class whites. Even more, if it's in fact true that the main reason why a number of working class whites abandoned the Democrats after a long, long period of very strong pro-democratic affiliation or identification following the New Deal in the 1930s, if it's the case that that was mainly driven by the turn in the economy in the 1970s and early 1980s, then if something akin to that happens in the reverse, which could be the case, I'm not saying it's going to be the case, but again, if the economy turns up, Obama is reelected, the Democrats make some gains, the healthcare reform sticks, a few other policies get passed, it wouldn't surprise me if the Democrats are looked at by many working class whites in the same way that they used to be back in the 1950s and 1960s. If they're then able to reverse, in other words, the stigma that came with that very, very bad and prolonged economic patch in the 1970s. Okay, I'm going on way too long. This last point will be very short, and then I'll stop and happily take questions. So the last thing is, so even if all of what I've said so far is more or less accurate or is reasonable, it still could be the case that despite public opinion not being a huge obstacle, and despite Democrats continuing to get elected, reasonably well, more or less as well as they've done in the last half century or so, that it'll be very difficult to do anything because of the structure of our political system. And the key thing here, of course, is what academics often refer to, political scientists often refer to as the abundance of veto points in our political system. Essentially, good policy has to get through a lot of hurdles in order to, or good policy proposals have to get through a lot of hurdles at the federal government level to actually be enacted into policy. Unlike most other countries, we have a separate executive and legislature. So even if the left or the Democrats dominate both houses of Congress, the president can still veto stuff that gets through. That's true in almost no other rich country. There are a few exceptions to that. We have two more or less equal legislative bodies. That too is true in almost no other rich country. Most other countries have two bodies, but one of them